On the evening of July 19th, 1940, the entire European continent seemed to hold its breath as one man stepped to a podium in Berlin to decide the fate of the world. The stunning, lightning-fast collapse of France had rewritten the calculus of military history, leaving the German war machine standing triumphant from the fjords of Norway to the borders of Spain, an unstoppable juggernaut that had shattered the old order in a matter of weeks. Yet across the narrow, fog-shrouded waters of the English Channel, one island nation remained stubbornly, seemingly irrationally at war, defying the mathematical certainty of its own destruction. What happened that night was not merely a political speech or a diplomatic maneuver, but a collision of two diametrically opposed psychological realities that would determine whether the summer of 1940 marked the end of the British Empire or the beginning of the Third Reich's slow demise. The atmosphere inside the Kroll Opera House in Berlin was electric with the heat of victory and the blinding glare of stage lights as Adolf Hitler prepared to deliver what he believed would be his final, magnanimous gesture to a defeated enemy. This was not a gathering of desperate men plotting survival, but a coronation of conquerors, where the uniformed elite of the Wehrmacht gathered to receive their laurels in a ceremony dripping with Wagnerian pageantry. Hitler, standing at the absolute zenith of his power, looked out over an assembly of generals who had just delivered him the prize that had eluded the Kaiser a generation prior, and in a gesture of supreme confidence, he promoted 12 of them to the rank of field marshal in a single stroke. The message to the world was unmistakable in its arrogance. The war was effectively over, the continent was secured, and the only thing preventing global peace was the stubborn refusal of the British government to acknowledge the reality of their situation. As the applause thundered against the ornate walls of the opera house, Hitler began to speak, his voice modulated with the practiced cadence of a man who believed himself to be the reasonable arbiter of Europe's destiny. For nearly 2 hours, he wove a narrative that positioned Germany not as a brutal aggressor, but as a victim of British intransigence, a victor forced into battle by warmongers in London who refused to see reason. He did not scream or rage in the manner of his earlier campaign speeches, but instead adopted the tone of a sorrowful statesman, presenting his case with a chilling calmness that suggested the outcome was inevitable, regardless of Britain's response. He painted a vivid, terrifying picture of Germany's absolute military dominance, pointing out with cold logic that the Wehrmacht had crushed every army it faced and that the Luftwaffe now controlled the skies, while Britain stood alone with its army shattered and its heavy equipment abandoned on the sands of Dunkirk. In this hour, I feel it to be my duty before my own conscience to appeal once more to reason and common sense in Great Britain as much as elsewhere, Hitler declared, his words broadcast simultaneously across the globe to capitals waiting in anxious anticipation. He framed his proposition not as a demand for surrender, which would have stung British pride, but as an appeal to logic, stating, "I consider myself in a position to make this appeal since I am not the vanquished begging favors, but the victor speaking in the name of reason." It was a psychological masterstroke intended to undermine the British will to fight by offering them a way out that preserved their empire and their dignity, requiring only that they accept Germany's hegemony over Europe. To the foreign correspondents scribbling furiously in the gallery and the diplomats listening in Washington and Moscow, the offer seemed incredibly seductive, a rational conclusion to a conflict that threatened to consume Western civilization. However, 600 miles away in the smoke-filled, claustrophobic corridors of Whitehall, the perspective was radically, fundamentally different. Winston Churchill sat in the dim light of 10 Downing Street, not listening to the broadcast with the trembling fear Hitler imagined, but with a grim, bulldog determination that had already hardened into concrete policy weeks before the Führer even approached the microphone. Churchill did not need to hear the speech to know its contents, for he understood the essential nature of the Nazi regime better than any other statesman of his era, recognizing that any peace treaty signed with Berlin would be nothing more than a temporary truce leading to eventual servitude. While Hitler spoke of reason and common sense, Churchill sat with a glass of whiskey at his elbow, embodying a defiance that transcended military logic, grounded in the absolute moral certainty that survival at the cost of liberty was no survival at all. The disconnect between Berlin and London was absolute, fueled by Hitler's profound inability to comprehend the psychology of the British government under Churchill's leadership. The German High Command, including General Franz Halder and the newly promoted field marshals, viewed war as a Clausewitzian extension of politics. a rational equation where superior force dictated the terms of peace. They assumed that because Britain had lost its greatest ally, its foothold on the continent, and its offensive capability, the British leadership would naturally seek to negotiate a settlement to preserve what remained of their imperial power. They failed to realize that Churchill had already fought and won the internal battle for Britain's soul back in May, during those desperate days when the War Cabinet had debated Lord Halifax's proposal to approach Mussolini for mediation. In those critical meetings, weeks prior to Hitler's July speech, Churchill had faced down the defeatist elements within his own government, arguing with a vehemence that shocked his colleagues that nations which went down fighting rose again, but those which surrendered tamely were finished. He had successfully purged the notion of negotiation from British strategy, convincing the cabinet that the only path forward was total resistance, even if it meant choking in their own blood upon the ground. Therefore, when Hitler's final peace offer floated across the airwaves, it arrived in London not as a lifeline to be grasped, but as a piece of enemy propaganda to be dismissed with contempt. Churchill, realizing that a personal response would only dignify Hitler's posturing, refused to speak, delegating the rejection to Lord Halifax, the very man who had once championed peace, forcing the appeaser to become the mouthpiece of defiance. The reaction in London was immediate and visceral, stripping away any illusion that the British public was clamoring for an end to the hostilities. The very next day, newspapers across the island nation splashed headlines that rejected the offer before the government had even issued a formal statement, with the Daily Express declaring Hitler's peace offer rejected, and the Times insisting there could be no peace without honor. This spontaneous eruption of defiance was a critical signal to the world, and particularly to the United States, that Britain's refusal was not merely the stubbornness of one elderly politician, but the collective will of a people who had looked into the abyss and decided to stand their ground. The BBC monitored the speech and translators worked frantically, but the decision had effectively been made by the momentum of history and the sheer moral weight of the events that had transpired since Dunkirk. When the news of the British rejection filtered back to the Berghof, Hitler's mountain retreat in Bavaria, where he waited for the capitulation he felt was his due, the reaction was volcanic. Albert Speer, witnessing the scene, described a Führer consumed by a rage that went beyond mere political frustration. It was the fury of a man whose entire worldview had been insulted. In Hitler's mind, the British refusal was a violation of the natural order, a rejection of the racial and power hierarchies that dictated the strong must rule the weak. He paced his quarters, ranting about British stupidity and their domination by Jewish warmongers, unable to process why a nation on the brink of annihilation would choose to continue a war it surely could not win. This confusion was mirrored in the diaries of his generals, with Halder noting the Führer's puzzlement, speculating that London must be pinning its hopes on some secret agreement with Russia or the United States. But beneath the rage lay a terrifying strategic dilemma that the German High Command had hoped to avoid. The nightmare of a two-front war was slowly becoming a reality again. Hitler had never truly wanted to destroy the British Empire, viewing it as a stabilizing force in the world that, ideally, would act as a maritime counterweight while Germany expanded eastward into the Soviet Union. By refusing to exit the war, Churchill forced Hitler to turn his military machine west, toward an operation for which the Wehrmacht was woefully unprepared. The directive for Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of the British Isles, had been issued tentatively on July 16, 3 days before the speech, but the wording, if necessary, revealed Hitler's deep reluctance to commit to a risky amphibious assault against the Royal Navy. Now, with the peace offer dead in the water, the if necessary became unavoidable, and the German military apparatus began to grind gears in a direction it had never intended to go. The Kriegsmarine, led by Grand Admiral Erich Raeder, looked at the plans for crossing the English Channel with a profound sense of dread, knowing that their surface fleet had been decimated during the Norwegian campaign and that they lacked the specialized landing craft required to move a modern army across a hostile sea. Raeder bluntly informed Hitler that the Navy could not guarantee the protection of the invasion fleet against the overwhelming might of the Royal Navy, unless the Luftwaffe could achieve absolute air superiority. The burden of victory thus shifted entirely onto the shoulders of Hermann Göring and his Air Force, setting the stage for a clash of technologies and wills that would take place in the skies above southern England. Göring, blinded by vanity and the Luftwaffe's easy victories over Poland and France, assured Hitler that his planes could smash the Royal Air Force in a matter of days, clearing the path for the invasion barges to cross in September. This overconfidence permeated the Nazi hierarchy, masking the logistical chaos that plagued the preparations for Sea Lion. In the ports of France and the Low Countries, German engineers began jury-rigging river barges for sea travel, cutting off their bows and installing concrete ramps, creating a makeshift armada that was dangerously unseaworthy. The soldiers of the Wehrmacht, trained for rapid panzer movements across open terrain, found themselves practicing amphibious landings in the canals of France, watching with trepidation as their flat-bottomed boats rocked violently in even mild swells, foreshadowing the disaster that awaited them in the chop of the Channel. Meanwhile, Churchill used the rejection of the peace offer to galvanize the British war effort, turning the threat of invasion into a unifying cry for total mobilization. He toured the coastal defenses, his presence a visible reminder that the government remained steadfast, inspecting the newly formed local defense volunteers and the battered remnants of the army returned from Dunkirk. The factories of Britain roared to life, churning out Spitfires and Hurricanes at a rate that defied German intelligence estimates, driven by a workforce that understood the alternative to production was slavery. Churchill knew that rejecting Hitler was a gamble of existential proportions, one that relied on the Royal Air Force holding the line just long enough for the United States to awaken from its isolationist slumber. The diplomatic cables flying between London and Washington during this period reveal the high-stakes poker game Churchill was playing with President Franklin D. Roosevelt. He needed to prove to the American president that Britain was not a lost cause, that it was a fighting asset worth investing in, and the rejection of the peace offer was the strongest possible card he could play. Roosevelt, constrained by an upcoming election and a public deeply wary of foreign entanglements, watched with admiration as the British prepared to face the onslaught alone. The Destroyers for Bases deal, which would trade 50 aging American destroyers for leases on British territories, was born out of this newfound American confidence in British resolve, a direct strategic consequence of Churchill's refusal to bow to Berlin's threats. As July turned to August, the phony peace evaporated, and the reality of the air war began to dawn over the English Channel. The Luftwaffe began probing attacks against British shipping and coastal defenses, testing the reaction times of the RAF and seeking to draw the British fighters into a battle of attrition they could not theoretically sustain. The German pilots flying from airfields in France could see the white cliffs of Dover on clear days, a tantalizingly close objective that represented the final barrier to total victory. But as they crossed the Channel, they encountered something the Polish and French air forces had lacked: a sophisticated, integrated air defense system backed by radar, a technological edge that would prove decisive in the weeks to come. The stage was now set for the Battle of Britain, a conflict that was the direct result of the collision between Hitler's expectation of submission and Churchill's policy of defiance. The last appeal had failed, not because of a misunderstanding of terms, but because of a fundamental incompatibility of values. Hitler's speech, intended to be the final act of the war in the West, instead became the opening bell for its most dangerous phase. As the German bombers revved their engines on French airfields, and the young pilots of the RAF strapped into their cockpits across southern England, the world watched to see if the decision made in that smoke-filled room in London would save civilization or condemn it to 1,000 years of darkness. The rejection of Hitler's peace offer did not result in immediate silence, but rather the deafening roar of Daimler-Benz and Rolls-Royce engines clawing for altitude over the English Channel. The German High Command, now stripped of the illusion that Britain would simply roll over, initiated the sequence of events that would become the Battle of Britain, a conflict defined not by territorial conquest on the ground, but by a ruthless, three-dimensional chess game played at 20,000 feet. From the perspective of the Luftwaffe pilots stationed in the Pas-de-Calais, the mission seemed deceptively straightforward: destroy the Royal Air Force, secure the corridor, and escort the invasion fleet to the Kentish coast. They were the apex predators of Europe, veterans of Spain and Poland, flying the Messerschmitt Bf 109, a machine that was in many respects the pinnacle of aeronautical engineering. Yet as they throttled up and climbed into the August haze, they were flying into a strategic trap that Hermann Göring, in his infinite arrogance, had failed to identify. Across the Channel, inside the subterranean operations room at RAF Bentley Priory, The war looked entirely different. It was a war of blips and vectors, controlled by Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, a man who possessed the stoic, unyielding temperament of a university professor rather than a warrior. Dowding had spent years fighting his own government for funding to build a defensive network that integrated the new top-secret technology of radar with a complex system of ground-controlled interception. While German intelligence believed the radar towers lining the British coast were hopeless primitive relics, British WAAF operators sat in dark rooms, wearing headsets, watching the electromagnetic pulses of the incoming German formations, long before they were visible to the naked eye. This was the asymmetrical advantage Churchill had banked on when he refused to negotiate. He knew that while Germany had the numbers, Britain had the eyes. The clash, when it came, was a chaotic, swirling melee that defied the orderly formations Hitler had watched in his military parades. German bomber crews flying Heinkels and Dorniers found themselves beset by hurricanes and Spitfires that dived out of the sun with terrifying precision, guided to their exact location by the calm voices of controllers miles away. The psychological impact on the Luftwaffe was profound. They had been told the RAF was down to its last 50 planes, yet every day fresh squadrons rose to meet them, a stubborn, regenerative force that seemed to defy the laws of attrition. For the German fighter pilots, the battle became a race against the fuel gauge. The Bf 109 had limited range, giving them only minutes of combat time over London before they had to turn back or risk ditching in the freezing channel. They were tethered to the continent, fighting an enemy who could land, refuel, and rearm in their own backyards, sometimes returning to the fight 3 or 4 times in a single day. By late August, the stress on both sides was reaching a breaking point, and the narrative of the war shifted from military targets to a contest of sheer national will. The Luftwaffe, frustrated by its inability to knock out the RAF's airfields, began to lose its tactical discipline. On the night of August 24th, a flight of German bombers, drifting off course due to navigational errors, jettisoned their payloads blindly into the darkness. The bombs did not fall on airfields or oil refineries. They fell on the purely civilian districts of central London, shattering the fragile, unwritten rules that had kept the capital cities off limits during the early stages of the air war. It was a mistake, a tactical blunder by exhausted crews. But Winston Churchill, sensing a psychological opening, interpreted it as an escalation that required an immediate, visceral response. Sitting in the cabinet room, Churchill ordered a retaliation that terrified his own air staff. A bombing raid on Berlin. The distance was extreme, the payload negligible, and the military damage would be minimal. But the strategic intent was purely psychological. When RAF bombers appeared over the skies of Berlin the following night, the shock to the Nazi hierarchy was absolute. Hermann Göring had famously boasted that if a single enemy plane ever flew over the Reich, he would change his name to Meyer. And now the wail of air raid sirens echoed through the streets of the Nazi capital. Hitler, who had been resting at the Berghof, returned to Berlin in a fury that eclipsed his reaction to the rejected peace offer. The British had dared to touch the sacred heart of the Reich, and in his rage, Hitler made a decision that would ultimately save the Royal Air Force and doom his plans for invasion. Standing before a frenzied crowd at the Sportpalast on September 4th, Hitler delivered a speech that will abandon all pretense of the reasonable statesman he had played in July. If they declare that they will attack our cities in great measure, we will erase their cities, he screamed, his voice cracking with hysteria. It was here that the strategic objective shifted. He ordered the Luftwaffe to stop attacking the RAF's critical infrastructure, the airfields and radar stations that were on the verge of collapse, and turn the full fury of the German air fleet against London itself. This was the Blitz, a campaign of terror designed to break the morale of the British people and force the government to the negotiating table through sheer suffering. But in doing so, Hitler granted the RAF the one thing they desperately needed: time. From the perspective of the Londoners, the war now descended from the skies into their living rooms, transforming the mundane geography of the city into a frontline battlefield. Every night the sirens wailed, a rising and falling mechanical scream that sent millions scurrying into Anderson shelters in their gardens or deep into the tile bowels of the London Underground. The Luftwaffe came in waves, dropping high explosives that turned Victorian terraces into matchsticks and incendiaries that sparked firestorms capable of sucking the oxygen out of the air. The nights were lit by the hellish glow of burning docks in the East End, painting the Thames in terrifying shades of orange and red. Yet precisely because Churchill had refused to negotiate, the British people had been psychologically prepared for this ordeal. They had been told the worst was coming, and they had resolved to endure it. Churchill himself became the living embodiment of this resistance, recognizing that his visibility was as important as any military directive. He walked the bombed-out streets the morning after raids, climbing over piles of still-smoking rubble, tears streaming down his face as he encountered the survivors. When he flashed the V for Victory sign, it was not a gesture of triumphalism, but of shared defiance, a signal that the government was still functioning, that the center was holding. The German High Command, analyzing reconnaissance photos of the devastated city, assumed that panic must be setting in, that the social fabric of Britain was unraveling under the tonnage of high explosives. They projected their own fears into the enemy, failing to understand that for the British, the bombing had the opposite effect. It solidified a collective hatred of the Nazi regime and a grim determination to see the war through to the bitter end. As September dragged on, the crucial date for Operation Sea Lion, the 21st, loomed and then passed. In the offices of the Kriegsmarine, Admiral Raeder watched the weather reports with growing relief, knowing that the window for a channel crossing was closing with the onset of autumn gales. The Luftwaffe had failed to achieve air superiority. In fact, on September 15, now celebrated as Battle of Britain Day, the RAF had inflicted such heavy losses on the German bomber formations that it became clear the daylight raids were unsustainable. The invasion barges still massed in the ports of France sat idle, bobbing uselessly in the water, targets for RAF bombers that now roamed the coast with increasing impunity. The final peace offer had been backed by the threat of annihilation, but the threat had been met, absorbed, and blunted. Inside the Reich Chancellery, the mood shifted from triumphalism to a brooding strategic restlessness. Hitler, confronted with a British obstacle that refused to budge, began to look elsewhere for the victory that would secure his legacy. The failure to bring Britain to the negotiating table meant that Germany was now trapped in a long war of attrition, dependent on imports of oil and raw materials that the British naval blockade was slowly strangling. In a decision born of strategic frustration and ideological obsession, Hitler turned his eyes east toward the vast steppes of the Soviet Union. He convinced himself and his generals that Britain was only holding out because they hoped for a Russian intervention, and that by crushing the USSR, he would finally force London to capitulate. It was a fatal miscalculation, a direct consequence of Churchill's stubbornness in July. Britain had become the anvil upon which the German hammer had broken itself, forcing the Wehrmacht to march toward its own destruction in the snows of Russia. Across the Atlantic, the events of the summer of 1940 had a profound impact on the Oval Office. Franklin Roosevelt, who had privately feared that Britain might succumb to the Nazi juggernaut, now saw proof of life. The reports from the U.S. Embassy in London, transmitted by observers who had watched the dogfights and walked the ruins, painted a picture of a nation that was battered but structurally sound. The Great Refusal of July proved to the Americans that Britain was a worthy investment, a forward operating base for democracy that had to be sustained at all costs. The flow of supplies across the Atlantic turned from a trickle to a flood, culminating in the Lend-Lease Act, which effectively ended American neutrality in all but name. Churchill's no had bought the time necessary for the sleeping giant of American industry to wake up and begin the production of armaments that would eventually overwhelm the Axis powers. The long-term consequences of that single decision in July 1940 rippled out across the next 5 years of global conflict. Had Churchill accepted Hitler's terms, the map of the world would have been drawn in darker ink. A neutralized Britain would have meant no staging ground for the D-Day invasion, no unsinkable aircraft carrier off the coast of Europe to launch the strategic bombing campaigns that crippled German industry, and no Arctic convoys to supply the Soviet Union during its darkest hours. The liberation of Western Europe in 1944 was only possible because the door had been held open in 1940. The soldiers who stormed the beaches of Normandy 4 years later owed their foothold to the pilots who had fought in the summer sky, and the politicians who had held their nerve when the logic of defeat seemed irrefutable. By the spring of 1941, the Blitz had killed over 40,000 British civilians, destroying entire neighborhoods and leaving historical landmarks in ruins. Yet the strategic purpose of the campaign had failed utterly. The British economy had not collapsed, the government had not fallen, and the morale of the people, tempered in the fire of the raids, had hardened into steel. Hitler, realizing the futility of the attacks, gradually redeployed the Luftwaffe to the east for Operation Barbarossa, leaving Britain scarred but undefeated. The final peace offer was never repeated. The dynamic had shifted permanently. There would be no more talk of negotiation, only unconditional surrender, not of Britain but of Nazi Germany. In the final analysis, what Hitler said when Churchill refused his offer, the mix of sorrowful posturing, rage, and bewilderment, revealed the central flaw of the Nazi totalitarian worldview. They believed that power was the only currency of history, that terror could bend any spine, and that material superiority guaranteed victory. They could not compute the variable of moral courage. Churchill's refusal was not based on a calculation of aircraft numbers or division strength. It was a moral choice to reject a world dominated by tyranny, regardless of the cost. He understood that a peace bought with the soul of a nation is no peace at all. As the smoke cleared over Europe in 1945, revealing the horrors of the camps and the devastation of the continent, the true value of that refusal became clear. The survival of Britain in 1940 was the pivot point upon which the 20th century turned. It was the moment when the unstoppable force of fascism met the immovable object of a free people's will. The peace Hitler offered was the peace of the graveyard, the silence of a continent under the jackboot. By choosing war, by choosing the blood, toil, tears, and sweat, Winston Churchill and the British people ensured that the flame of liberty, however flickering and fragile, was not extinguished in the hour of its greatest peril. If you were in Churchill's position in July 1940, with France fallen and your army shattered, would you have risked total annihilation to fight on, or would you have negotiated to save your empire? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell.